The iron chains dug deep into his flesh, but the Mustang didn't fight. He stood still, his dark eyes reflecting the fading sunlight, his breath slow and steady. He wasn't afraid, not anymore. The railroad tracks stretched endlessly in both directions, cutting through the vast, open land. The wind howled softly, rustling the dry grass around him. Somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote called into the twilight. But the Mustang did not flinch. He had run his last race. A cruel man had done this, one who saw wild beauty as a nuisance, a creature to be broken or discarded. The Mustang had once roamed freely, the leader of his herd, his spirit untamed. But freedom had made him a target. The landowner, a man known for his ruthlessness, had ordered the Mustang captured. The ranch hands had chased him for days, their lassos tight, their whips cruel. But the Mustang had refused to surrender, until the trap had been set. A narrow ravine, an ambush, and then, the chains. Now, he stood bound to the cold steel of the tracks, his powerful legs trembling from exhaustion, his ribs rising and falling with each slow breath. Then, the ground began to rumble. A low, distant roar. The faint sound of a whistle. The train was coming. The Mustang closed his eyes. He had fought his whole life to stay free, but now, he was powerless. There would be no escape. Then, a voice. A shout. Footsteps pounding against the ground. Someone was coming. But was it too late? The whistle screamed through the air, a long, shrill warning that sent birds scattering from the treetops. The ground trembled, the iron rails vibrating beneath the Mustang's hooves. The train was close, too close. Then came the pounding of boots against dirt. Fast. Desperate. Whoa, easy now. The Mustang's ears flicked at the voice, deep and commanding but not unkind. His tired eyes barely registered the figure racing toward him, a man dressed in a dust-covered duster, his hat pulled low over his brow. The man saw the chains first, thick, rusted iron links wrapped cruelly around the Mustang's legs, bolted to the rail. His stomach twisted in disgust. He had seen cruelty before, but this? This was a death sentence. He didn't have time to think. The train was barreling toward them, the whistle screaming again, the sound like a warning from fate itself. The Mustang flinched at the noise, shifting his weight but not fighting. He had already accepted his fate. But the man hadn't. Not today, boy, he muttered, dropping to his knees. His fingers scrambled at the chains, searching for a weak point. Nothing. They were bolted tight, meant to hold until the train did its job. A rush of heat burned through his chest. No animal deserved this. The Mustang was strong, proud, this wasn't how his story should end. The train's headlamp cut through the dusk, a blinding eye of fire growing larger by the second. The man gritted his teeth and reached for his belt. His knife. The blade wasn't meant for iron, but he didn't have a choice. He sawed at the thick rope wound between the chains, the one that had been used to tighten the trap. Sparks flew as the blade scraped against metal. The train was closer now, too close. The Mustang snorted, his nostrils flaring as his instincts screamed at him to run. But the chains held firm. The man's hands worked faster, the blade slipping in his grip. The train's roar drowned out everything else, the earth shaking beneath them. "Come on," he growled, his heart pounding. The rope snapped. The Mustang jerked as if he felt the change. But the chains were still there. The train was nearly on top of them now, the massive steel monster bearing down. One last bolt. One last pull. The man yanked with everything he had, and the chain gave way. The Mustang reared, his front legs kicking high, his muscles surging with sudden freedom. He stumbled backward just as the train screamed past, a blur of steel and dust that nearly sucked them both beneath its wheels. The man hit the ground hard, rolling away from the rush of wind and metal. His hat flew off, dust swirling in the wake of the passing train. And then, silence. The Mustang stood a few feet away, his chest rising and falling, his dark eyes locked on the man who had just saved his life. For a moment, neither of them moved. The man sat up, breathing heavily. "You all right, boy?" The Mustang didn't run. He didn't bolt into the wild like any other freed creature would. Instead, he stepped forward. The man's breath caught. He had expected gratitude. What he hadn't expected was recognition. This Mustang knew him. The dust settled. The last echoes of the train faded into the distance. The Mustang stood still, his dark eyes locked onto the man who had saved his life. There was something there, something beyond mere instinct. Recognition. The man felt it too. A prickle of familiarity, like a half-remembered dream clawing its way back to the surface. He pushed himself up slowly, brushing the dirt from his coat. His body ached from the fall, but he hardly noticed. The Mustang took a cautious step forward. "Easy now," the man murmured, holding up a steadying hand. "Ain't got no rope on me. You're free to go." But the Mustang didn't move. A gust of wind kicked up dust between them, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, something long buried clawed its way to the surface of the man's mind, a memory, raw and unforgiving. A young colt, no bigger than a dog, standing on wobbly legs beneath the shade of an old oak tree. A man's hands, his hands, reaching out, brushing against a warm muzzle for the first time. The colt had been born too early, frail and weak. The rancher had wanted to put him down, said he wouldn't last a season. But the boy, his younger self, had begged for a chance. "Just one season, Pa. If he ain't strong enough by winter, I'll let him go myself." The man swallowed hard. Could it be? He took a step forward, slowly, carefully. The Mustang didn't flinch. His ears flicked, his nostrils flared, but he stood his ground. The man's voice was barely a whisper. "Dusty?" The Mustang's ears perked at the name. A cold weight settled in the man's chest. It was him. The same colt he had raised, nursed back to strength, only to set free when winter came. But that had been years ago. His fingers curled into fists. How had Dusty ended up here? Captured, chained to the tracks, left to die like some worthless animal? His jaw tightened. He already knew the answer. The landowner. The same ruthless man who had bought up the old ranch when his father passed, the one who had pushed out the wild horses to make way for cattle. The man's blood boiled. This wasn't just cruelty. This was personal. Dusty huffed softly, stepping closer until his breath ghosted over the man's face. "I'm sorry, boy," the man murmured, reaching out. His fingers grazed the Mustang's neck, feeling the warmth beneath the dust and sweat. "I should have never let you go." But Dusty didn't shy away. He pressed his forehead against the man's chest, as if saying, "I remember you too." For the first time in years, the man felt something stir inside him. Something he thought he had lost. Hope. But before he could speak, a gunshot rang out in the distance. Dusty jerked back, his ears swiveling, his body tensing. The man's heart pounded. He turned toward the sound, his instincts kicking in. He knew that shot. It was a warning. They weren't alone. The gunshot echoed through the canyon, rolling over the hills like distant thunder. Dusty flinched but did not run. The man, however, knew exactly what that sound meant. Someone was watching. Someone wanted him to know. His hand hovered over his hip, fingers twitching toward an empty holster. Damn. He had left his gun back at camp. Dusty let out a low snort, shifting uneasily. His body was still tense, but he wasn't bolting. That was strange. Wild horses ran at the first sign of danger. But Dusty, he was different. The man turned his gaze toward the ridgeline. A lone figure on horseback sat in the fading light, watching. Not moving. Just watching. Then, slowly, deliberately, the rider tipped his hat and rode off. The man exhaled through gritted teeth. They knew. Whoever had chained Dusty to those tracks hadn't done it just to get rid of him. This was a message. The man crouched down, running his fingers over the raw wounds around Dusty's legs. The marks weren't fresh. They were deep, old scars layered over new ones. His stomach clenched. Dusty had been in chains before. This wasn't just some Mustang caught up in a roundup, he had been held, tied down, maybe even worked. The man's fingers found a rough patch on Dusty's neck. He traced the uneven fur, then froze. A brand. His blood ran cold. Cattle were branded. Ranch horses, too. But wild Mustangs? Never. Dusty had been someone's property. The man pulled his hand away slowly. Someone had caught Dusty after he let him go. Someone had taken that free-spirited colt and turned him into a captive. The anger burned hot in his chest. "Who did this to you, boy?" he whispered. Dusty exhaled sharply, nostrils flaring. He took a step closer, pressing against the man's side like he used to when he was a scared colt. It didn't matter where Dusty had been. He was here now. And whoever had done this, they weren't done with him yet. The man glanced back at the empty ridgeline, his jaw set. This wasn't over. The ridgeline was empty now, but the man knew what he had seen. That rider wasn't just a passerby, he had come to send a message. And the message was clear: stay out of this. The man ran a hand over Dusty's neck, feeling the raised scar of the brand. His gut twisted. Whoever had done this had meant to break him, to turn a wild, free creature into something controlled. But Dusty wasn't broken. Not yet. The Mustang shifted beside him, ears swiveling, sensing the unease in the air. He was waiting, for what, the man wasn't sure. A long breath left his lungs. He had a choice. Walk away and pretend none of this mattered, or dig deeper. He already knew which one he'd choose. With one last glance at the fading sunset, he grabbed Dusty's rope and clicked his tongue. "Come on, boy. We got work to do." The town with secrets. By the time they reached the small town, night had fallen. The saloon's lamps flickered in the dusty air, laughter and clinking glasses spilling into the street. He tied Dusty to the post outside and stepped onto the wooden porch. Inside, the usual crowd filled the tables: ranch hands, drifters, and men with too much whiskey in their bellies. But it was the man in the corner who caught his eye. James Calloway. The landowner. The man who had spent years driving out the wild Mustangs, selling them to the highest bidder, or worse. Calloway leaned back in his chair, nursing a drink, his boots propped up on the table. He looked like a man who owned everything around him. The man clenched his fists and forced himself to walk slow, steady. He stopped at Calloway's table and pulled out a chair. Without asking, he sat down. Calloway barely looked up. "You're either stupid or got a death wish." The man didn't blink. "You chained a Mustang to the tracks today." A small smirk curled at Calloway's lips. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "That so?" The man leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Why?" Calloway sighed, finally setting his drink down. He studied the man for a moment, then chuckled. "You really don't get it, do you?" He shook his head. "That Mustang? He ain't just another horse. He's a problem." The man's jaw tightened. Calloway leaned in, lowering his voice. "That horse cost me a deal. A big one. Fella was willing to pay a fortune for him, said he had good blood. You wouldn't understand, but some men. They don't want Mustangs for ridin'. They want 'em for their strength, their speed. The man's stomach twisted. He knew what Calloway was hinting at. Some men took wild Mustangs and turned them into pit horses, brutal underground fights where only the strongest survived. Calloway shook his head. But that one? He wouldn't break. Wouldn't obey. Kept throwin' my best men. So I figured, if he ain't good for sellin', he's good for sendin' a message. His smirk returned. Guess I should have made sure the train finished the job. The man's fingers twitched. Every muscle in his body screamed to slam Calloway's head against the table. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he stood. Slowly. Calloway raised a brow. That's it? No threats? No fight? The man's voice was ice. You'll see me again. And with that, he turned and walked out. The Mustangs fight. Back outside, Dusty was waiting. He flicked his ears as the man approached, his deep eyes steady. The man ran a hand down his neck. We ain't done yet, boy. Because if Calloway thought Dusty was broken, he was wrong. And the man was going to prove it. The cool night air pressed against the man's skin as he untied Dusty from the hitching post. His hands were steady, but his mind burned with fire. James Calloway thought he had won. Thought he could play God with creatures that deserved to be free. But he had underestimated two things. The will of a Mustang. And the man who had once called that Mustang family. As he swung into the saddle, Dusty shifted beneath him, muscles tensing like he knew something was coming. The man clicked his tongue. Let's ride, boy. They slipped into the darkness, hooves barely making a sound against the packed dirt road. But they weren't alone. A few hundred yards behind them, in the shadows of the alleyways and rooftops, men were watching. Waiting. Then, the town exploded into movement. Gunfire cracked the silence. Shouts rang out. The man yanked the reins. Go! Dusty didn't hesitate. He bolted, kicking up dust as he shot forward, his powerful legs carrying them into the open desert. Behind them, hoofbeats thundered. Calloway's men. They were being hunted. The wild run. Dusty ran like he was made of lightning. The wind howled past the man's ears as they cut across the open plains, weaving between dry brush and scattered rock formations. The pursuers were close. Too close. Bullets whizzed past, kicking up dirt near Dusty's hooves. The man gritted his teeth. He had no gun, no way to fight back. The only thing he had was speed. And trust. He leaned forward. You still got it in you, boy? Dusty snorted, as if insulted by the question. Then, he surged forward. The land sloped downward, leading toward the canyon. The man saw it immediately, a narrow pass, flanked by towering rock walls. A dead end? No. A trap. The man's pulse hammered in his ears. He had been here before. Years ago, as a boy, racing Dusty through these very same canyons. He remembered something. A narrow cut in the rock, just wide enough for a Mustang, but not for fully loaded riders. Calloway's men didn't know about it. He urged Dusty on. Faster. The canyon walls loomed ahead. The pursuers were right behind, shouting, firing. Then, he saw it. A gap, barely visible in the moonlight. The man let go of the reins. Dusty didn't need them. The Mustang veered sharply, hooves skidding on loose rock, and plunged through the hidden pass. Behind them, the men didn't have time to stop. The first horse slammed into the rock wall. A cry of pain. Then another. Riders scrambled, their mounts rearing, trying to stop before the canyon swallowed them whole. Dusty and the man burst out the other side, untouched. For a long moment, silence. Then, a single laugh escaped the man's throat. "Good boy." Dusty snorted, his ears flicking back as if to say, "Told you so." But the fight wasn't over. Calloway would know by morning. And next time, he wouldn't just send men. He'd come himself. The night stretched long and quiet as the man and Dusty rode further into the wild. The distant echoes of gunfire had faded, but the danger hadn't passed. Calloway would regroup. He'd send more men. The man exhaled through his nose, scanning the horizon. He knew they needed shelter, somewhere to rest, somewhere safe. There was only one place left. A familiar face. A dangerous gamble. By the time they reached the outskirts of an old homestead, the moon hung high, bathing the wooden fences in pale light. The cabin beyond was small but sturdy, nestled between a grove of trees. Smoke curled from the chimney. Someone was home. Dusty shifted beneath him, uneasy. The man didn't blame him. He swung down from the saddle, stroking Dusty's neck. "I know, boy. I don't like it either." But they didn't have a choice. He stepped toward the house and knocked. For a long moment, nothing. Then the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, his face shadowed. The glow of the lantern behind him cast just enough light to reveal his features, strong, weathered, and wary. "Didn't think I'd see you again," the man in the doorway muttered. The Mustang savior held his ground. "Didn't think I'd come back." The tension between them was thick, tangled in a past neither of them wanted to discuss. But there wasn't time for old wounds. "I need help," the man said simply. The other man's jaw tightened. He glanced past him at Dusty. His eyes narrowed at the Mustang's wounds, the branded scar. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," he said. "I don't care." A long silence. Then, with a heavy sigh, the man stepped aside. "Get inside." The Mustang savior hesitated, then nodded. But as he crossed the threshold, something in his gut twisted. Something felt wrong. Dusty huffed behind him, shifting uneasily. The man turned, just as the shotgun clicked. His stomach dropped. The man who had once been his friend now held a gun to his chest. "I'm sorry," the old friend said. The front door slammed shut. The price of betrayal. It didn't take long. Boots thundered outside, the sound of riders approaching fast. Calloway's men. The man clenched his fists. "You sold me out?" His old friend wouldn't meet his gaze. "I didn't have a choice." The anger boiled beneath his ribs. "We always have a choice." The door burst open. Calloway stepped in first, slow and deliberate, his boots clicking against the wooden floor. His smirk was back, that same smug confidence the man had seen in the saloon. "Well," Calloway drawled. "Look what we have here." Two men shoved their way inside, rifles at the ready. The man didn't move. He wouldn't give Calloway the satisfaction. "I should thank you," Calloway said, pacing the room. "Didn't think you'd run straight to someone who owed me a favor." He cast a glance at the old friend, who looked away in shame. The man's jaw tightened. "What now?" Calloway grinned. "Now?" He gestured outside. "Now, we take back what's mine." "Dusty." The Mustang neighed loudly, sensing the tension, his hooves scuffing against the dirt. Calloway's smirk widened. "Reckon it's time to break that wild spirit of his once and for all." The man's blood turned to ice. He knew what Calloway meant. Dusty wouldn't be sold. He wouldn't be trained. He'd be destroyed. The rage that had been simmering inside him finally snapped. The man lunged. He barely made it 2 steps before a rifle stock slammed into his gut, knocking the wind from his lungs. He hit the ground hard. Calloway crouched beside him, shaking his head. You just don't learn, do you? The man gasped for air, but all he could hear was Dusty's frantic cries outside. His vision blurred. His head spun. The last thing he saw was Calloway standing tall over him, smirking. Then, darkness. Pain. That was the first thing he felt. A sharp, throbbing ache in his ribs, a dull pounding in his skull. Then came the sounds, muffled voices, the scrape of boots against dirt, the distant, restless whinnies of a horse. Dusty. The man forced his eyes open. The world swayed before him, blurred and shifting. His hands were bound behind his back, thick rope biting into his wrists. He was slumped against the wooden post of an old corral, his legs weak beneath him. Calloway stood a few feet away, leaning against the fence, smoking a cigar. The glow of it flickered in the night, illuminating his satisfied smirk. "Didn't take much to bring you down," he said lazily, blowing out a cloud of smoke. "All that trouble, all that runnin', for what? A damn horse?" The man's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. Calloway nodded toward the center of the corral. "Guess it don't matter. You lost." The man turned his head, and his stomach dropped. Dusty was there, trapped inside the wooden enclosure, his legs bound in rope, his mouth pulled tight with a cruel bit. The Mustang snorted, shifting uneasily, but the ropes held firm. A burly ranch hand stepped forward, a branding iron glowing red-hot in his grasp. The man's breath hitched. They weren't just going to take Dusty. They were going to break him. His mind raced. He had to do something. But with his hands bound, his body aching, and Calloway's men watching his every move, there was no way out. Unless. The man looked past the corral, beyond the ranch house, to the darkened hills in the distance. He wasn't alone out here. He had lived on this land long before Calloway came along. He knew every ridge, every hiding spot. And he knew that if he had seen Dusty's chains, others had too. A gamble. A long shot. But the only chance he had. He straightened his spine, forcing his voice to steady. "You're making a mistake, Calloway." The rancher chuckled. "That so?" The man nodded. "You don't own everything. And you sure as hell don't own the wild." Calloway's smirk faltered just slightly. A whistle cut through the air. Calloway barely had time to turn before gunfire erupted from the hills. The fight for freedom. Shouts rang out as bullets struck the dirt near the corral. Calloway's men scrambled for cover. Through the chaos, the man felt hands tugging at his bindings. "Reckon you could use some help," a gruff voice muttered. The ropes fell away. The man looked up, his old friend, the one who had betrayed him, was now cutting him loose. The man didn't waste time asking why. He just ran. Dusty was still struggling against the ropes in the corral, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. The man leaped the fence, landing hard beside him. "Hold on, boy," he muttered, fumbling with the knots. Calloway cursed, raising his pistol. The man yanked Dusty's bindings free just as Calloway fired. The bullet grazed Dusty's flank, and the Mustang reared in pain, but he didn't fall. Instead, he charged. Calloway barely had time to react before Dusty slammed into him, knocking him flat. The man didn't look back. He swung onto Dusty's back, gripping tight. "Run, boy." And Dusty did. The Mustang bolted, hooves pounding against the earth, weaving through the gunfire, past the panicked men, past Calloway still gasping in the dirt. Then, freedom. They broke past the last fence line, into the open plains. The wind howled past them, the stars above stretching wide and endless. The man pressed a hand against Dusty's neck. "You did good, boy." The Mustang snorted, his stride never faltering. The ranch, the men, Calloway, they were behind them now. They had won. But the man knew, Calloway wasn't done. Not yet. The wind howled across the open plains as Dusty galloped, his muscles rippling beneath the moonlight. The man clung to his back, the rhythmic pounding of hooves echoing through the night like a heartbeat. They had escaped, for now. But the weight of what lay behind them still pressed heavy on the man's chest. Calloway wasn't the kind to forget. And he sure as hell wasn't the kind to forgive. Dusty snorted, as if sensing his rider's unease. The man ran a hand over the Mustang's neck, feeling the steady warmth of the wild creature beneath him. "Don't you worry, boy. We ain't done yet." They rode until the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of soft pink and gold. Only then did the man pull Dusty to a stop at the top of a ridge overlooking the valley below. Here, the land stretched wide and untamed, rolling hills, winding rivers, endless sky. This was where Dusty belonged. The man swung down from the saddle, landing softly in the grass. He turned to Dusty, reaching out to undo the makeshift rope bridle. The Mustang huffed, shifting slightly, but didn't pull away. The man hesitated. He had fought so hard to save this horse. Nearly died for him. And now, he was letting him go? His fingers trembled on the knot. Maybe Calloway had been right about one thing: some creatures couldn't be tamed. But he had been wrong to think that was a weakness. Freedom wasn't a curse. It was a right. The last knot came loose, and the rope fell away. Dusty blinked, his ears flicking back. For a long moment, he didn't move. The man swallowed hard. Go on now. The Mustang just stood there, watching him. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, not away, but closer. The man felt something tighten in his chest. He reached up, pressing his hand against Dusty's forehead. "You ain't mine to keep, boy." Dusty exhaled softly, his breath warm against the man's palm. Then, he ran. Not out of fear. Not because he had to. Because he could. The man watched as Dusty galloped down the ridge, his mane whipping in the wind, his stride long and effortless. He didn't stop. Didn't look back. And the man smiled. Not all goodbyes were sad. Some were exactly the way they were meant to be. Dusty was free. And in some way, so was he. Epilogue: A Man's Legacy. Weeks passed, and the world moved on. The man heard whispers of Calloway leaving town, his business collapsing after word spread of what he had done. Justice had a way of finding the wicked, one way or another. As for the man, he never went back to the ranch life. He wandered, worked where he could, lived by the code his father taught him. But every now and then, when the nights were quiet and the wind blew just right, he swore he could hear the distant sound of hooves pounding against the earth. And he knew, somewhere out there, in the wild places no man could touch, Dusty was still running. Because some spirits were never meant to be broken. And some legends? They never fade.